Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad to have everybody with us today. If you haven't, go ahead and grab you some coffee or a cookie or a pastry and some water. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we are glad to welcome you to this week's History is Lunch. We're in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium here in the two Mississippi Museums, the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where you can watch this week's or any of our previous History is Lunch programs at any time. I hope that you will join us next Thursday, July 17th, for History Happy Hour from 5 to 7 p.m. We're going to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, enjoy some live music with local blues band, the Rusted Strings, food from Aplos and Jerk City Grill, and a cash bar. Visitors will also have a chance to win some prizes during a voting rights-themed trivia. So we hope that you'll tell your friends and that you join us next Thursday, July 17th at History Happy Hour. Next week's History is Lunch is Miss Malika Polk-Lee, the Executive Director of the B.B. King Museum and Delta Interpretive Center. And we're going to have the pleasure of her presentation, 100 Years of B.B. King. Not only is this what would have been the 100th birthday of Medgar Evers, but also would have been the 100th birthday of Mr. B.B. King as well. But today we are excited to welcome Suzanne Stearns. Stearns is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Mississippi. She received her doctorate from the University of Chicago in 2011. And earlier this year, Stearns' first book and the subject of today's History is Lunch, Empire of Commerce, the Closing of the Mississippi and the Opening of Atlantic Trade, won the Center for Presidential History Book Prize from Southern Methodist University. In addition to Empire of Commerce, Stearns has produced publications focused on how the Trans-Appalachian West, the region encompassing the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, came to be incorporated into the American Union in the 1780s and 1790s. So please welcome Suzanne Stearns.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us today. One quick correction, Drew. I'm an associate professor, which is a big deal in my world. So, okay. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the Mississippi River and the founding of the nation. And I want to get started with a story. So in 1789, this young man stood along the banks of the Mississippi River in Natchez and swore an oath of allegiance to the crown of Spain. On its surface, this actually isn't particularly shocking. This young man was originally from North Carolina, but he'd moved to the westernmost district of North Carolina at the time, which is basically the area around Nashville now. And he was one of thousands of Americans who had, between 1788 and 1795, would go and swear their allegiance to Spain. But what is a little surprising is about who this particular young man is. And I'm not sure if you guys recognize him in this shot. This is a little bit older than he was at 22. But you might recognize him as this man. So in 1789, Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, one of the people who we most associate with 19th century America, he's got an entire era named after him, an entire mode of democracy is named after him. But 40 years earlier, he stood along the banks of the Mississippi River and essentially promised that he would always be a loyal vassal to the crown, to the King of Spain. So how do we understand this? What drove Jackson to decide he wanted to become a vassal of Spain? And what caused a world where this man who we so associate with Americanism would make a decision like that 40 years earlier? So I'm going to jump ahead and tell you the answer. And it's probably not going to be very surprising given the fact that the talk today is about the Mississippi River. What drove Andrew Jackson to take this oath of allegiance to Spain was his desire to obtain access to the Mississippi River. And so when we think about the American founding, we tend to think about places like New York City or Philadelphia or Virginia. We tend to think about people like George Washington or John Adams. We tend not to think about people like Andrew Jackson, who at 22 had served in the American Army during the war. He was a 14-year-old during the war, captured by the British. It's a really interesting story. But we tend not to think about men like him in our story of the American founding. Moreover, we tend not to think that right as the United States was starting to take shape, it was also starting to expand. So before it was even really a thing, it was also something that was spreading. Maybe like COVID-19 or something. Like before people knew it was there, it was spreading. Not to make that analogy, but that sort of thing. By the time we get to 1790, over 100,000 Americans are going to live west of the Appalachian Mountains in what's now Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. And what if we think about the American founding from the perspective of those people, from the perspective of people like Andrew Jackson, who were looking at the United States as it was taking shape from the perspective, from the viewpoint of the West? So Jackson swore his allegiance to the Crown of Spain in 1789 because 5 years earlier, in 1784, Spain had closed the Mississippi River to American trade. Now, this is something that doesn't often get mentioned in US history textbooks. It's probably not something that you guys, I don't know how often you think about the 1780s. Might have been a moment. I also don't know, exactly what was in your textbooks about this moment, but generally this isn't mentioned. The fact that in 1784, Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. And I'm going to be honest and say I was well on my way to my PhD. I'd already achieved a master's degree in early American history before I discovered this, before I knew that Spain had closed the Mississippi to American trade. And I actually learned about it from reading the very first newspaper that was published west of the Appalachians, the Kentucky Gazette, which began publication in 1787. And if you ever have the opportunity to read the Kentucky Gazette, it's all digital, you can read it online. The very first issue, from the very first paragraph, is all about this issue. What are we going to do about the closed Mississippi? How are we going to obtain access to the Mississippi? Should we remain part of Virginia? Will that make it more likely for us to gain access? Should we break off from Virginia? Should we break off from the United States? What will give us access to the Mississippi? And for me, as a graduate student, when I read this, I was like, what is going on? I have no idea. And so as I started looking into it, I learned a lot of things that I really definitely did not know prior to that. So I want to start by thinking a little bit about what the United States looked like in 1784, or right after the American Revolution. We know about the 13 original states, but this is the area sort of just to the west and southeast of them. After the American Revolution, all this area in white, all this area over here in white was part of the United States, including what's now Kentucky and Tennessee. And everything west of the Mississippi River was part of Spain, was Spanish territory. What was left in sort of confusion between the two was this region in blue. This region was claimed by both Spain and the United States after the American Revolution. It's this region that includes where we are right now, here in Jackson, but also an area that stretches from the 31st parallel, which is roughly the border between Florida and Georgia, north up to Paducah, Kentucky. And if we want to think about why this area was contested between the two powers, it has to do with the agreements that were made at the end of the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the United States had fought, obviously, with Britain, with its ally, France. And in 1779, Spain had also declared war on Britain. Now, Spain refused to ally with the United States. Spain was an empire in its own right. It had no interest in supporting a rebellion against an imperial power, but they were more than happy to go to war with England. So they declared war as well, and they entered as a co-belligerent. And beginning in 1779, the Spanish were incredibly effective in opening a second front in the American Revolution in this region. So they captured British forces, they defeated British forces in Baton Rouge and at Natchez. They drove the British out of Mobile and Pensacola. And effectively, they penetrated as far north as the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi, right around Cairo, Illinois, Paducah, Kentucky. And after the war, when they signed the treaties between the various powers, there were two different treaties. The first treaty was signed in the morning. And it was signed between the United States and France and Britain. And in that treaty, England guaranteed to the United States and France all territory of West Florida, which is why the Americans claimed it went all the way, their new territory went all the way to here. However, the treaty didn't actually specify where West Florida was. Later that afternoon, Britain signed another treaty. And in that second treaty between Britain and Spain, ending their conflict, they made a different agreement. They agreed that Spain would claim all territory that it had effectively conquered. In other words, Spain's now claiming all the way north up to Kentucky. There was one other thing that was a very big disagreement between the two treaties. The first thing is that the American-English-France treaty gave the United States the right to access the Mississippi River. It gave the United States access to travel along the Mississippi and export goods through the port of New Orleans. And that's because England had that right for the previous 20 years, and so they were just conferring it to the United States after they had lost their territory in the region. However, what had changed, what was a big change, is that when the United States signs its treaty, it has absolutely no claim, and it does not pretend to have any claim to this region south of the like the toe of Louisiana, essentially, that that little weird boot of Louisiana. South from there, the United States makes no claims on having any access to that territory. In other words, England signs a treaty that says that Americans are going to be able to travel through some other country's territory. Right? They're giving the Americans right to travel through Spanish territory to get to the Mississippi. And the Spanish are like, in what universe can a different country say, you have the right to navigate through my property? And so after the Revolution, because of these two big issues, these concerns over this contested land and this concern over the right to navigation in the Mississippi, Spain closes the Mississippi to American trade. Now, in 1784, if you were actually stood in Jackson, Mississippi, you would have no idea that either Americans or Spanish were claiming it. It was clearly Choctaw land. But maps like this do tell us a lot about how Euro-Americans and Europeans are understanding the world they're moving through. Right? It's telling us about imperial early America. And when Spain closes the Mississippi in 1784, it sets off a real crisis. One of the things that I was struck by as I began researching this river were a couple of different questions. Number one, why would Spain close the river? Number two, how do you close a river? The Mississippi is enormous. How do you close a river? Other things I was really struck by really quickly was how big of an issue this was at the time and how little we knew about it. So from 1775 to 1789, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, they had a lot of problems. When I teach this to my college freshmen, they all come in with like a little bit of an idea of what the issues were under the Articles of Confederation that led to the writing of the Constitution. They're like, oh, there were taxation problems, and unanimity problems, and things like that. They have like a vague idea. I'm assuming, hopefully, that maybe you do too. If you don't, that's okay. You can ask me about it later. But if we actually look at the period right after the Revolution really closely, what we see is that the things that were really big issues at the time actually wasn't taxation. They do talk about taxation, but that's not really the biggest issue. The biggest one, the most divisive one, is this issue of Mississippi River trade. And very few issues in the 1780s threatened to fracture the American Union more than this issue of Mississippi River trade. So stepping back for a second, when I started writing this dissertation, I was writing it in 2008. You guys might remember 2008 as the sort of the height of the 2008 financial crisis, right? And this is a financial crisis brought on by real estate, and big questions about what makes real estate valuable, right? Is it the value that somebody who owns property gives to it, or is it the value that the bank gives to it? Is it the value that the market gives to it? What makes real estate valuable? And the reason that I mention this is that these questions were things that were on my mind in 2008, and that they were, I remember in 2008 being offered a mortgage by Countrywide Financial, and I was a graduate student, and my declared income the previous year had been something like $6,000. And I was like, in what universe should I get a mortgage, right? Like, there's no way that that should happen. And the fact that I was being offered one really did raise some big questions for me about what was happening in the market. And as I was at the same time learning early American history, I was struck actually by a real similarity. And that was this. So in 1780, Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense, one of the main philosophers of the American Revolution, wrote a book that's less commonly paid attention to than Common Sense, but it was called The Public Good. And in The Public Good, he argued that the United States would be fine after the war. It didn't matter that they were going deeply into debt to fight. They'd be fine. And the reason they would be fine was because they had a unique asset, land. And so in Common Sense, in Common Good, what Tom Paine argues is this. He says, lands are the real riches of the habitable world and the natural funds of America. The funds of other countries are, in general, artificially constructed, dependent upon credit, and always exposed to hazard and uncertainty. But lands can neither be annihilated nor lose their value. On the contrary, they universally rise with population, and rapidly so, when under the security of an effectual government. So when we think about the early American Republic, right after the American Revolution, it's really important to think that this is one of the future images they have of the United States. After the American Revolution, the United States was deeply in debt. And my saying it was deeply in debt just doesn't capture the degree to which they had no money. In 1785, Congress had to borrow $16, right? They had no money. And so what are they thinking how are they thinking they're going to refill their coffers? What are they going to do? And Tom Paine's argument is they're going to sell Western land. And that's really important for us to keep in mind as we move forward, because it's going to be really the key issue with the Mississippi River. When we're talking about Western lands, when Paine was talking about Western land, he meant land in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. And for all of that land, many, many people, the United States in general, but also individuals across the political and economic spectrum, are all going to gamble their future prosperity on Western land. Okay, so as we move forward, a couple of big questions we're going to be thinking about. Number one, why did the Mississippi matter? And that's our first goal. What's up with the Mississippi? Number two, what gives land value? And number three, how did this almost divide the United States before it was even really created? And so, with that said, and a very long introduction done, we'll get moving. Okay, so in 1775, a mad rush for Western land began. As British control over the colonies unraveled, Euro-Americans who had previously been prohibited from buying land in the West start flooding over the Appalachians into what's now Kentucky. The push came from two different but linked directions, but no matter who we're talking about when we're talking about why they're moving to Kentucky, they're moving to Kentucky because they're looking for land. Right? So Kentucky land very quickly gets this reputation for being something truly remarkable. The stories that are told are that if you grow an ear of corn in Kentucky, it'll take 3 men to lift it, right? That you can create a garden in Kentucky just by you throw out the seeds and there will be a garden, right? The land in Kentucky is so rich, it actually can't grow wheat because the wheat just weighs too much and just can't stand up straight. And so these are the stories that are being told about Kentucky. And of course, these stories are incredibly appealing to early American farmers and to early American wealthier individuals like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who look at the West and see new possibilities for economic opportunity. One way that stories of the West are spread is by mouth, but another is through guidebooks like this one, which is the first guidebook to Kentucky. This is a later edition from 1793, but it was originally written in 1784. And it spreads these stories about Kentucky and about what you can expect if you go to Kentucky. And these stories reach a very wide audience. And many, many people become speculators in Western land. One man who does is a guy named John Dunlap, who's from Pennsylvania, who was the editor of the United States Gazette, and at one point claimed 130,000 acres of Kentucky land. Although some Western speculators were from places like Pennsylvania, most were from Virginia, like John May, who there are no images of. But at one point in the 1780s, John May claimed over 340,000 acres of land, which, to put into perspective, is 5 times the area of Jackson. Right? So he's claiming a huge amount of land. There are others who are claiming even more. William Blount, the first governor of Tennessee and the senator from Tennessee, has claims so much land, it's an area larger than the state of Delaware. Right? And he claimed so much land that the Cherokee called him the Dirt King. He was so eager to obtain land. So we've got these Western speculators who are investing in Western land. And what they imagine is that because the Western land is so special, thousands and thousands of normal people are going to want to move there and buy the land. And they're right about one part. Thousands and thousands and thousands of normal people do flock to the West. Right, and go to try to settle in the West. But almost none of them are hoping to buy land from speculators. Right? That's not why people are moving west. And that's not really part of our often told story of Western migration, right? We imagine more of like a homestead ethic. These people who are moving west, they're really interested in getting land just through their labor, right? They want to find land that nobody else has claimed. They want to build a house on it, and they want it to be theirs based on the fact that they did this labor, that they took this risk to claim land. So right away you can see that there's a conflict building between the speculators who think that these people should buy land from them and the people who are moving to the West who are like, yeah, I have very little desire to buy land from, say, George Washington. George Washington constantly complains about people settling illegally on his land. They have very little interest in actually paying for that. They want land, they want free land, essentially. They're like, that's why we fought the American Revolution, to obtain land. But in a battle between speculators and sort of everyday people, who do you think usually wins? The speculators win, and the speculators win because they have a very powerful ally, the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia has very little interest in giving away free land. Right? Virginia owns Kentucky, and Virginia's plan is that they're going to they'd gone deeply into debt during the Revolution, just like the United States had, and their plan is to remake all the money that they lost by selling Western lands. And so primarily they sell things like this one, which is a warrant that allows the holder, in exchange for 40 pounds, to purchase 100 acres of Western land. Another way people were claiming land was through military warrants. These were issued as payment to soldiers who'd fought for Virginia during the war. And while you didn't actually have to pay for this land, you would actually have to pay in order to obtain the land, because land can't be actually claimed unless it's also surveyed and then entered into an entry book. And there's sort of a bunch of legal fees that need to be paid along the way to actually turning something like this piece of paper or that piece of paper into an actual land claim. Okay, now neither of these two types of warrants, neither the treasury warrant nor the military warrant, is actually tied to a specific plot of land. Like, none of them give you longitude and latitude for the land that they're tied to. What you're supposed to do instead is go to Kentucky, find land you like, get it surveyed, and then tell the government, oh, I'm going to claim this land. Well, it's really hard to know what land people have claimed. And so what they end up doing in Kentucky is people keep claiming the same land. All right, so this is a single town in central Kentucky. As you can see, some plots of land have dozens of claims, made on them. If you ever wonder why Ohio is divided so beautifully into squares and the rest of the country, including Mississippi, were divided into those squares, it's because they looked at Kentucky and they're like, let's not do that again. Right? The only people who actually made money off Kentucky land were lawyers. And this was being litigated into the 1830s. Like, who claimed what land how was a really big question. So in order to claim land, in order to win land in Kentucky, you're going to need to do several different things. Number one, you're going to have some sort of warrant that says you're entitled to the land, whether it's treasury, there's a couple of other ways you can get it, but you're going to need to have that. You're going to need to get the land surveyed, you're going to have to pay a fee in order to have that happen. You're going to have to enter your land in two different places. One is in Kentucky, the other one is across the Appalachian Mountains in Richmond. You got to get on the other side of the Appalachians to enter your land. And then once you've claimed land and once it's been confirmed to you, you're going to have to pay taxes on it if you want to hold on to your land. So how are they going to do that? If you think about Kentucky, Kentucky has no gold mines, it has no silver mines. What Kentucky has is great soil, but great soil isn't really, how do you turn soil into cash, right? Kentucky can produce incredible amounts of agricultural produce. The main things that it can grow are, they do eventually grow flour. They grow corn in abundance, and then they create corn's two main byproducts, which are pork and whiskey. And they can grow those really easily, but everybody in Kentucky has those same things. They don't need to sell them. So what they imagine, people who are settling Western land imagine that they're going to be able to do is they imagine that even though they have no cash right now, they're going to be able to claim land and then pay for it using the produce of the land that they've claimed, right? So essentially what they kind of want is a mortgage. Nobody has any money at the moment, but if they've got all this great productive land, they'll be able to turn it into cash eventually, and then they'll pay. Right? And that's their logic. Gilbert Imlay, who was an early Kentucky promoter, and actually a really fascinating guy, he's Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's father. Amongst other things, you get around if you're Gilbert Imlay. Kentucky to Paris is a long way. But in 1792, he sort of explained the logic of what people in Kentucky imagined was going to happen with their land. He said that such a quantity of beef, pork, bacon, butter, cheese, etc., might be furnished from this country as will one day, no doubt, furnish the West India Islands and afford relief to the miserable Chinese. Right? He's thinking that stuff produced in Kentucky is going to be exported into the Caribbean. It's going to go to Havana. It's going to go to Haiti. It's going to go to, eventually, to Liverpool, maybe even all the way to India or to China. And it's going to be used, that's going to be how Kentucky is going to get the money it needs to secure the land. But there's a really big problem with this dream, which is this, the landscape, essentially. So this is early Kentucky. In the 1780s, there's two main ways you can get to Kentucky. The first one is you can go down the Ohio River, so you see that up there. Floating down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh to, say, Louisville would take about 2 weeks. It's pretty easy to do. You don't really need to know much about seafaring to do it, but if you do decide you're going to take the river route, you do face one really big issue, which is in the 1770s and 1780s, this region is at war. And Native Americans across the Ohio River in what's now Ohio are very easily able to sit along the shore and just shoot at people going by in boats, right? You're pretty vulnerable if you're in a boat. The second way you could get to Kentucky was you can go overland along what's called the Wilderness Trail. If you go this way, it's not much better in terms of a safety perspective. This is actually running you through Cherokee territory. The Cherokee are not particularly happy about. Also, too, it's a really long, arduous overland journey. It might take about 8 weeks to get from Richmond to Kentucky. To put that in perspective, you can actually get from New York to London faster in this time period than you can get from Virginia to this other part of Virginia, right? So part of the problem with the wilderness road that you run into, if you decide you're going to try to go overland that way, is that it goes through the Cumberland Gap. And I don't know about you, but if I were thinking about exporting goods, right, growing something in Kentucky and then getting it back to a market in the east, I don't think I'd want to carry it over the Appalachian Mountains, right? That's going to add so much labor, so much difficulty to the process of moving goods that it's not really feasible to go over land as your method of carrying goods to market. Likewise, boats, right? So the Ohio River runs very fast, and it runs from the east to the west. And one of the big issues that they run into there is that the boats that they use are boats like this. This is a flatboat. As you can see, it's basically a shed that people trust to water, essentially. And it's not something you can use to actually maneuver in the water. It's good for going downriver, but it won't help you get back upriver at all. And so there's no real way that people in Trans-Appalachia can get goods back to the east. Even if you went back up the Ohio River, even if you somehow were able to sail and row and pole yourself back up the Ohio River, you'd end up in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh does not need flour exported to it. Pittsburgh's got its own flour, right? So there's no real market in either of those places for Kentucky goods. So what Kentuckians imagine they're going to do is they're going to sell everything they produce down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And that's their vision of the future. So when Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade, what it's actually doing is cutting off this possibility of trade for the West. And it's cutting off the possibility of Westerners actually gaining the land that brought them to the West in the first place. And the Spanish know this. They know this very, very well. Spain's first representative to the United States, a man named Don Manuel Galloso de Lemos, who's going to also be the governor of Spanish Natchez and then Spanish Louisiana, he was very clear about why Spain was closing the river. He said that the value of the Western land depends upon the navigation of the river. Without access to the Mississippi, the value of the land will fall. And fall it did. When Spain closed the Mississippi River, sales of Western land fell off dramatically. The value of Western land dropped by about 80%. So you've got people who've gone deeply into debt to buy Western land, those speculators who now can't in any way pay for the land that they've already purchased. Okay, so at this point, people always ask me, how do you close a river? Well, you actually don't have to close the whole river. You only need to close a couple of strategic spots on the river. It's actually very similar to the strategy of like the Union Army during the American Civil War, where there's only a few highlands along the river that if you can control those highlands, you can control most of the river. So one of them is at Chickasaw Bluffs, which is now Memphis. Another one's at Walnut Hills, which is now Vicksburg. And the last one's at Natchez. If you can control those high points, you can actually stop people from going back upriver because you can just put a cannon on top of the hill, essentially, and just fire at people in the river. Or you can send out boats to go capture anybody coming down or up the river. It's not as great, their closing of the river isn't as great for catching people going downriver, but if you're trying to go back up the river against the current, there's no way you're doing that if somebody doesn't want you to. And actually, in 1784, when Spain closed the Mississippi to American trade, Spain actually hadn't sent anyone up the river in 3 years because the Chickasaw had actually previously closed the river to Spanish trade. But, you know, Madrid doesn't really care about that. So this is essentially how you close the river. And actually, Americans who came down the river during this time period would find their goods confiscated, and they would often find themselves imprisoned. So some Americans who tried to trade down the river while the river was closed would actually be put in jail. And a few died. So, okay. So Westerners are in this bind where they can't figure out how are they going to get this river reopened. And so they turn their attention to Congress. So if we look at Congress in the 1780s, you probably remember the 13 original colonies. You've got New England, which includes New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, so 4 states there. There's the 4 states, the Mid-Atlantic, here in green, and then the 5 states of the South, essentially. And this is, when they hear that the Mississippi River has been closed to American trade, everybody's upset. They're all angry. They know that Western land is tied to is tied to trade on the Mississippi. What they disagree about, though, is what they should do about it. And so in the South, many constituents of Southern congressmen have purchased land in Kentucky and Tennessee, and they're adamant that the Mississippi River needs to be reopened. But people in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states have a slightly different perspective. At the end of the American Revolution, those maritime states, places like Massachusetts and places like New York, fell into an incredibly deep depression. And they did because they had nobody to trade with. England wasn't going to let the upstart Americans trade back in their empire. Like, that's why the empire started, right? It was about trade restrictions in the first place. England's like, you're not trading with us. France does allow Americans to trade with them, but not with their colonies, only with France in Europe, continental France, and that just isn't a big enough market for the Americans. And so they are incredibly anxious about finding markets for their goods, for the produce that they can produce. They've got all these thousands of sailors who are out of work in these cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And what they really want is trade. So one of the key places they want to trade with is Spain. And so when the Spanish send an official to trade with them, they have three main issues they want to talk about. One is trade. Two is boundaries. Where does the United States end? Where does Spain start? And lastly, the Mississippi. And these are going to be the three issues they're going to start negotiating with Don Manuel Gayoso de Lemos when he becomes the first Spanish minister to the United States. And the particular issue for the eastern states in terms of trade is that what they've got to sell in abundance is fish. So Cape Cod obviously is named after the codfish, right? This is the codfish. New England's soil isn't great, but its sea is amazing. It's teeming with sea life. And Spain is a particularly excellent market for fish. And the reason for that is that Spain is Catholic. And Catholics in the 18th century do not eat meat on any Friday and don't eat meat for the 40 days of Lent. And so their market for fish is almost like, you can't fill it. They need so much fish to meet those needs. And so what the eastern states, the states like New England, are interested in is obtaining that, opening that market for themselves. The other real big thing that Spain has is gold. Spain has huge silver and gold mines in places like Mexico and Peru, and the United States has none. The United States has no gold. And they know that if they sell things to Spain, Spain's going to pay for them in gold. It's going to pay for them in cash. If they trade stuff to England, England's going to pay for it in like manufactured goods, but Spain, in contrast, is going to pay in gold. And so this question becomes in Congress, which one is more important to the United States? Is it trade with Spain or is it access to the Mississippi? And people's answer depends entirely on which part of the United States they're from. So after 2 years of debate, John Jay, who's from New York, one of those maritime states, and Don Diego de Gardoqui realize that they're never going to come to an agreement over these two things. Spain is not going to let Americans navigate on the Mississippi. But Spain will reopen trade. All that the United States needs to do is promise that they will, they'll cede their claim to the Mississippi River. And so John Jay writes this treaty with Gardoqui and then presents it to the rest of Congress. And he says this, he says, as the navigation of the Mississippi is not at present important, nor will probably become much so in less than 25 or 30 years, a forbearance to use it while we do not want it is no great sacrifice. In other words, we can afford to not claim the Mississippi for the next 25 years. It'll be okay. That way, our sailors will go back to work tomorrow. And yeah, I mean, we've got those Westerners out there, but they're fine. They don't really need access to the Mississippi. And what this does is it sets off a real crisis in Congress. People are writing back and forth constantly. They are screaming at one another on the floor of Congress. And again, everything divides along sectional lines. According to Arthur Sinclair of Pennsylvania, there's never has Congress had a more combative controversy than this one, than the one over the Mississippi. William Grayson of Virginia presents the southern side. He says that ratifying the treaty would render the western country of no value and thereby deprive the U.S. of the fund of which they depended, disaffecting the southern states when they saw their dearest interests sacrificed to obtain a trivial commercial advantage for their eastern brethren. In other words, the South is saying that this treaty essentially betrays their interest. It betrays the South. It betrays the West. And they argue extensively that if the West sees its interest betrayed now, it's not going to stay part of the United States. It's going to break off. It's going to become its own union. In contrast, New England feels really differently. Rufus King in Massachusetts says that not ratifying the treaty would be sacrificing the interest and happiness of 1 million to promote the views of a few speculating land jobbers. Right? There are 100,000 people living in the West. There are, say, 2,000 large land speculators in Western land. What makes their interest more important than all of the sailors, everybody in Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York? And the big question is, what does this mean for the United States? So New England looks at this and they get angry about this divide. And actually, New England starts to debate whether or not they should secede from the Union as well. They decide maybe we should create our own separate interests. We don't really have anything in common with the South. They are insisting on access to the Mississippi and refusing to acknowledge that we really need trade now. And so they start arguing about whether they should create their own separate confederacy. And these movements do start to happen. They start having these meetings. They're circulating information about what would happen if they did this. It's not really clear. The Articles of Confederation say don't say you can't do this, essentially. But they're arguing about it. And who knows what would have happened if that same summer, Shays' Rebellion hadn't broken out in Western Massachusetts, which makes it pretty clear pretty quickly that Massachusetts can't really function on its own. It needs other states. But it does lead directly to the writing of a new constitution. This debate convinces both the South and the North that they have to do something. They can't assert their interest with Spain. They can't even keep themselves from breaking up over every single issue. They're going to need to rewrite their governing document. And so they sit down to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, and they write the Constitution. Now, the Constitution, during the constitutional debates, the Mississippi River is mentioned several times, but it's actually physically in the Constitution in a couple of interesting ways. One way is that it really does provide this consensus to actually have the meeting in the first place, to write the Constitution. Many states had previously been like, no, we don't need to, but this debate over the Mississippi brings a lot of people to the table. They're like, yes, okay, we'll do that. Second thing, this debate convinces the states, especially the southern states, that states always have an interest in foreign policy, right? That the states need to have a role in foreign policy. And that is why our Senate, to this day, has the ability has the obligation of ratifying or rejecting treaties. It gives states power. Second thing, this is why treaties require 2/3 of the states to agree to a treaty. If 2/3 were not required, then New England and the Mid-Atlantic states would have been able to have given up claims to the Mississippi. But the South's like, nope, if we have 2/3 majority, then that's not going to let them do that. They're going to have to include us in any treaty negotiations. And so they decide to put that in the Constitution. Lastly, it raises big questions about the status of new states. Whether new states should enter as full states or whether they should enter as something else isn't really clear before this moment, but the Constitution says they should enter as full states. And a big part of why that is again, Southerners really pushing for it. They want Kentucky, they want Tennessee to be able to enter when they enter as new states and make that claim to the Mississippi River. Okay, so there's a lot of fallout from this. There's a lot of confusion about what it's going to be. But if you want to find out more, you can read about it in my book. You can ask me questions now. So my book is The Empire of Commerce, The Closing of the Mississippi and the Opening of Atlantic Trade. I've talked today mostly about the first half of the book. If you're interested in the second half of the book, that's where Mississippi specifically comes up a lot more. It talks about trade on the Mississippi, how it actually functioned. It talks about the Chickasaw and their role in Western trade. And it talks about how the calculus of cotton changes all imaginable conversations about the role of the Mississippi and about the role of the West. But for the moment, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
I think all of this is very interesting, but the big question in my mind is, how can people move move into another country and disregard the population that's already there? And listening to this narrative and not hearing a lot about the people who are already living on the land, it just leaves me with a lot of questions.
Absolutely, and understandably. This look we took today is an imperial history, right? So it's looking at the high-level government negotiation kind of stuff. The book itself does much more to talk about what's actually happening on the ground. But Kentucky is actually a really unusual place in the 1780s. So beginning in the 1700s, there were a series of wars that were fought amongst indigenous peoples of the Americas called, sort of a continuation of wars that are called the Beaver Wars. And these wars were largely driven by the desire of the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois, to expand. And they expand through primarily through creating new connections with new peoples, but also through capturing individuals to become members of their own tribe, but also to be enslaved. And these wars essentially happen when the Haudenosaunee have guns, and the people like the Shawnee and the Miami do not. And so they're really, really vicious wars, essentially. And what they tend to do, what they actually end up doing, is they hollow out Kentucky. So there are no indigenous towns or communities that actually are in Kentucky after 1740. And it's a really interesting place. And so it's actually a totally different story than what would have happened if we'd focused on Tennessee, where the Cherokee are incredibly important and a much larger population as well. But in Kentucky, there are far fewer indigenous people who are actually living on that land. Now, in part, that's because Kentucky had become a common hunting ground where multiple groups hunted in Kentucky but didn't live there, so traveled through and left. So Kentucky does have a very, very different story. At the same time, throughout all of history, I think it's pretty clear that people have been very happy to step onto land that isn't theirs and disregard the rights of the people who live there. It is the colonial project, essentially. And so, yeah, this is part of that story, essentially.
Thank you. Very informative presentation. Thank you. This is not some sort of a question, maybe an observation, maybe. But I was just wondering if somewhere in this topic of early Mississippi, there's a Louisiana Purchase feature somewhere in this time period, in this area. I was just wondering if the Louisiana Purchase, which is, the whole of the western part of the 13 colonies, that area there where we get that area from Napoleon, that area which includes Mississippi. Isn't there some connection between the Louisiana Purchase and your topic?
Absolutely. So 1784 is when Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade. In 1795, Spain and the United States negotiate Pinckney's Treaty, which actually guarantees what's now Mississippi to the United States, again, ignoring the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and their claims on the area. But it also opens up the Mississippi River to American trade. It also coincides directly with the establishment of cotton in the region. 1795 is basically the second year that cotton was grown in Natchez. And as a result, right as Natchez and the region surrounding it are becoming part of the United States, they're also becoming a cotton economy. And so from 1796 1796, essentially, on the Mississippi River is exporting goods because the treaty allowed them to. It lets Americans trade on the river. They're exporting cotton, they're exporting wheat, they're exporting pork, they're doing all that exporting, and they built a really valuable economy out of that trade. But in 1802, Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade again. So it had been open for about 6 years, and then they closed it. And that is the moment when Congress sends James Monroe to Paris to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. He's there not to buy Louisiana, he wants to buy New Orleans. That's the only thing he's authorized to actually purchase. Napoleon offers him all of the Louisiana Purchase, and he has to decide, is New Orleans worth buying all this other stuff? They're not sure, and they decide it is. But it's absolutely linked, and it's all about this desire to obtain unobstructed access to the Mississippi River.
If you covered this, I'm sorry I missed it, but where did the name Mississippi come from, the term? Did the Native Americans come up with that, or?
Yeah, it is a Native American word. It's from, I think, the Ojibwe people, but from the northern end of the Mississippi River, essentially. It's often loosely translated as Father of the Waters. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw used a Choctaw word for it that I'm not going to say aloud because my Choctaw is very weak. But it basically means foreign speakers are upon it. And that's how they talk about the Mississippi River, as this avenue for trade that it had been for centuries. This isn't, trading on the Mississippi is not new in the 1780s by any stretch of the imagination. This river had always been used, but that's where it is an indigenous word, and that's where it comes from.
Susan, we've got a question from the live stream from Facebook from Bob Rogers, and he asked, about 1798, America sent a gunboat down the Mississippi and forced the Spanish to leave Natchez. Was this largely for the reasons you discussed, to open trade to the river?
So it has to do with Pinckney's Treaty. So in 1795, Pinckney's Treaty is negotiated between the United States and Spain, and it gives this area, including what's now Natchez, to the United States. It confirms it to the United States. However, even though the treaty is negotiated in 1795, the United States, like nobody in North America, finds out about it till 1796. Right? We're living in an age of sail, so it takes a long time for information to get from place to place. So they find out about it in 1796. And the Spanish, when they first find out about it, and they originally, like the governor of Spanish Louisiana, finds out about this not from the Spanish government. He finds out about it when two Choctaw men get off a boat and tell him there's this new treaty that was passed. And he's like, wow, okay. So the Spanish officials locally are actually very unwilling to put into Pinckney's Treaty into action, and so they really don't. In 1796 and 1797, the Americans send officials to go survey the boundary between the two new countries. But there's a period for about 11 months, actually. There's a period for close to a year where the region surrounding Natchez declares its neutrality and says it's not going to be part of Spain or part of the United States until these issues are settled, essentially. So the gunboat is about Pinckney's Treaty and its conclusion, essentially. But it's still very much about trade. Absolutely.
You focused on Kentucky, but what about the states north of the river, like Ohio and Indiana? Do they have the same issues?
So Ohio and Indiana have an entirely different story of what's happening, and that's because, how I mentioned that Kentucky doesn't have a large resident indigenous population. Ohio does. So Ohio is the site of what's often called the Northern Confederacy. It's made up of Potawatomi, Shawnee, Miami, Pinkeshaw, Fox, many allied nations, essentially, that are fighting against the United States. And that war essentially picks up in 1785, and it goes through 1794 with the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which essentially opens up the area north of the Ohio River to American settlement, essentially. So there are many people who are claiming land in Ohio, and the earliest Ohio settlements are made in 1788. But in general, they're so focused on the war that they're not as big a part of this kind of argument, essentially.
Hi, yes. My question is, in Virginia, the Tappahannock and Rappahannock, the rivers or the transport back in the 1800s, were they part of this fight also, or were they not involved? Because the Choctaw and the Cherokees, their history is talking about how they could not export, import, and had trouble traveling the river there. So are they part of this treaty, or?
Well, they're part of a related phenomenon. One of the slides I cut out of the talk, but is about continental divides. You guys probably remember in like 4th grade or something learning about the continental divide and being told that there's one continental divide that divides the United States between the rivers that flow into the Pacific and the rivers that flow into the Atlantic. Actually, there are 6 continental divides in North America that dictate where water flows, essentially. And so between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, and south of sort of like an area right around the Great Lakes, all water that falls in that area, all rainfall, will ultimately end up in the Mississippi. And if your river flows from east to west, odds are you're going to end up in the Mississippi instead of being able to get back upriver. Trade can be done upriver, and for certain really high value goods, like fur, for instance, it's often brought upriver. But for most sort of lower value goods, like deer skin, so like beaver fur, valuable, deer skin, much less so, it can be difficult to actually export things going that direction. So it's part of the same phenomenon of like of pre-industrial water dictating where trade can actually happen, but not part necessarily of this same set of claims.
Susan, before we wrap up, you mentioned and you kind of alluded to a little bit of what was happening in Natchez, but can you give us kind of a quick summary? What's happening right here around the Natchez district in the 1780s and 90s? And we'll definitely need to have you back to have more than a 3-minute answer.
Okay, so in the 1780s and 1790s, Spain owns this region, but there are almost no Spaniards actually living there. There's only 12 Spanish people, like people from actual Spain, living in what's now like the Natchez district, essentially. There's 120 soldiers, most of whom are probably from continental Spain, but they don't count because nobody counts them in census data, essentially. But there's 12 actual Spanish people. The majority of people who live there are people who had left during the American Revolution when the territory was British and had settled there. And then the other group of people that were there were people like Andrew Jackson, who had moved down to the region in order to obtain either land or trade rights, essentially. And so for that time period, this region is a tobacco growing region. It's developing a plantation economy. So they're growing tobacco using enslaved labor, and then they try growing indigo using enslaved labor. Neither is extremely successful. Nobody likes Natchez tobacco. It's not a very good saleable object. And so they're trying to figure out what is going to work in that region, essentially. The other big thing that they're doing is that they are, Spanish officials in that region are focused on negotiating agreements with the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, the Alabamans, and other smaller indigenous groups in the region, the Quapaw, the Osage, which are not small, but they're on the other side of the Mississippi. They're doing a lot of diplomacy with those groups, in part because they want to create sort of a barrier against Americans. And they want to keep Americans from expanding further and further west. And so they're creating alliances with the Cherokee and other indigenous groups in the area. And that's sort of their diplomatic focus in the region. It isn't until cotton becomes really the crop, which, so as I mentioned, it begins to be planted in 1794 and 1795. They plant like 3,000 pounds the first year. They plant like 15,000 pounds the second year. And by 1800, so within 6 years, they're planting 3.2 million pounds of cotton, right? It's an explosive economy of cotton once they start planting cotton. You see like an entirely different region taking shape than it had been under like Spanish control. So it's a different kind of thing.
Awesome. Could you follow up in Vicksburg?
Mm-hmm.
On his question, how was Vicksburg different than Natchez, if at all?
So Vicksburg had far fewer settlers, and it has much less river trade, essentially. And by settlers, I mean Euro-American settlers in that time. Most Euro-Americans are concentrated in Natchez, with very few outside of that region. There are a few families in Vicksburg, and there's a great book I can recommend by Christopher Morris called who wrote a book on Vicksburg specifically, that I would highly recommend on that. But it's sort of similarly, it's not yet really part of Euro-American settlement to a large degree. So.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, let's give Susan Stearns a round of applause. If you have questions that you didn't get to ask, or you would like to purchase and have Susan sign a copy of her book, Empire of Commerce, The Closing of the Mississippi River, the Mississippi and the Opening of Atlantic Trade. It's an excellent read. The second half has a ton of Mississippi information in it, so highly recommend it. But once again, let's give Susan a round of applause. Thank you, guys.